Though now the bat wheels silent by, and not a swallow twitters, yet still the solitary humblebee sings in the beanflower. Those are the words of the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, written from his garden on a warm Devon evening, reflecting on all the joy that nature has to offer. There's something so lovely about the sound of bees, busily working in fragrant blooms. We romanticise these insects, whereas others seem to be demonised or made monstrous. I'm looking at you, cockroaches. Even children know that bees are precious, like little heralds of plenty, making honey, showing up when the sun shines and the world smiles. And we've all heard how important it is to protect them. But what's the truth behind the threat to these insects? And what about all the other pollinators and the work they do? In the UK alone, there are 1,500 different pollinating insect species helping our plants reproduce. Those include moths, hoverflies, wasps, butterflies, and beetles. And around the world, bats, birds, and reptiles also play a part. But pollinator habitats are under pressure from human activity that causes biodiversity loss.
What we are seeing is a fairly robust pattern where insects are declining in diversity and in number.
Which means the wildflowers and crops that depend on these are also facing this pressure.
About 90% of flowering plants require pollinators. Many of those interactions between pollinators and plants are specialised, which means a pollinator has a unique relationship with one or just a few plant species.
Which means the people that depend on these crops are under pressure too, in terms of food supply, but also livelihoods and wider economics. A world without pollinators is a troubled one.
The world would be a much less colourful place. Our diet would be very, very much more limited, and we might not be quite so healthy.
They are responsible for basically maintaining everything that's produces flowers, the things that we get enjoyment from in nature, everything in your park and your garden, but also things that we depend on. So things that we build our houses out of, the clothes that we wear on our back, the food that we eat. All of these plants are propagating through using pollinators, whether they be insects or other animals.
Right now, we're not seeing people having to hand pollinate fruit, for example, which is the serious reality if we want to produce food and there's not insects to pollinate them. Usually by the time people actually realise they're in a crisis, it's gone too far to do too much about it.
We're learning fast, and there really is hope to avoid these worrying scenarios. Whereas there isn't a quick fix for the climate crisis, there are things we can do to reduce other pressures on pollinating species. So this time, let's hear how biodiversity connects to pollinator health, and ultimately, your health too. We'll look at how serious this decline is, and how it interacts innately with our plant world, and most of all, how science can help all of us take action to change the future for nature. I'm Dr. Maya Rose Craig. Welcome to Unearthed, Nature Needs Us. Professor Phil Stevenson is a plant chemist and the head of trait diversity and function at Kew. But what does that mean?
They are the properties that are of interest when you're trying to understand how plants and fungi interact either with each other or with other organisms.
That stuff is pretty vital when you're looking at solutions to some of our big ecosystem challenges, like finding crops that can survive in different and evolved climate conditions due to global warming.
The main challenge for global biodiversity at the moment is almost certainly climate change. And the trouble with climate change is that it's happening so quickly. Our plants and animals can't adapt and change quickly enough so that they can manage this change. So they're being pushed to the extremes more quickly than they can actually tolerate, and are getting pushed to the edge and possibly to extinction. The impact of climate change could be on either the pollinator or the plant. What we're seeing is changes in what we call phenology of those pollinators and plants. Phenology essentially around the flowering time, for example. So If an insect is emerging, a pollinator is emerging at one time of the year and normally coincides with a flowering plant, if the temperature changes or the climate changes, it means that those two organisms become out of sync. We're also seeing changes with the movement of, or the range at least, of some insects being pushed further north as the climate changes and warms up, but plants aren't able to move quite so quickly.
It's the native species that need to come first to support native plants.
We have over 100 species of bees just in Kew Gardens alone, which is about 30% of all of the species in the United Kingdom. So if you look across my office here, you can see a pinned collection of bees. I think this is most of the bee species that have been identified in the gardens. You can see up the top here we have a row of the different bumblebee species. We have around 25 in the UK. We've got probably over half of them here at Kew Gardens. You can see a whole collection here of bees that actually look a little bit like wasps. That's a group of bees called nomada. They're cuckoo bee species, and they essentially lay their eggs in the nests of other bees. These cuckoo bees will rely quite often in a very specific way on just one or two other species of bees. And if those other species of bees are reliant on just one plant species, one or two plant species, then you can see how the risks to that one plant could not only affect a specialist bee pollinator, but also the cuckoo bee. But actually, many of the wild species we have at Kew are here because we have native plant species, not because we've got lots of exotics planted. And it's those native species that are really important and need to be at the heart of any initiatives that we have to manage our biodiversity in cities or develop interventions that are meaningful and actually result in significant change.
It's not just the big, bad problem of climate change that's making pollinator life hard, though. There are other pressures which we could potentially act upon more quickly.
The main threats to pollinators are a combination of factors, and it's the interacting effects that probably cause most of the harm, but they comprise climate change, the loss of floral resources, which is associated with agriculture and land use change. It includes the use of agrochemicals, pesticides, which are targeted at insects, but also fungicides could harm other aspects of that ecosystem that are important to pollinators. But when you get these things interacting, that's when you get the really serious problems. I think the most important thing is that everybody understands there is a challenge and everybody understands what needs to be done. Individuals, farmers, politicians, policymakers.
We'll be back with Phil in the gardens later on. Let's hear more about how pollinators fit into the equation of our ecosystems and, ultimately, food production with Adam Hart, an entomologist, ecologist and Professor of Science Communication at the University of Gloucestershire.
Pollinators are organisms or entities, because we can think of the wind as a pollinator too, that act to transfer pollen from male parts of a plant to the female parts of a plant. So they are a means for a plant to reproduce sexually, basically. There's all kinds of organisms that are involved with pollination, birds, bats, almost anything that visits and gets resources from flowers. And of course, even within the insects, we tend to think of things like, well, the honeybee is the classic that everyone's thinking of, but actually there's a huge diversity of different insects and other invertebrates. But in some cases, pollinators are stealing resources from the plant and they're sort of pollinating as they go. In other cases, they're clearly being manipulated by plants, which is quite a cool thing.
When thinking about the threats to pollinating insects, Adam thinks there are also some ideological hurdles we need to face up to in order to make large-scale change possible.
I think of insects as the glue that holds most of the world together, actually. And they have these wealth of interactions with all sorts of different organisms and the environment. And we don't perceive them out there because we see something buzzing around and we just go, it's a fly. And actually, in this country, there's something like 7,000 species of fly. Insect diversity is staggering. In a way, we do know what we have to do. We have to stop living the way that we're living. But that becomes a sacrificial thing, right? We have to give stuff up. And that's quite a hard sell to people. We've got very used to being able to go into a supermarket and buy virtually anything we want. And virtually any time of the year. Yeah, it's ridiculous that I should be able to waltz into the local supermarket, even my local sort of small, corner shop essentially supermarket, and I can buy fresh strawberries. It's February. And what's more, we've got used to doing it cheaply in many cases, even with the cost of living crisis, actually. Food is still relatively cheap compared to what it was. And for us to change the way that we're using the land, for us to come about new farming practices, for us to be more sort of ecologically aware, we are going to have to make some big changes. It's going to be changes in production, but it's also going to be changes in the way that we consume and our expectations of consumption. And I think we should be making far more efficient use of the land. We should be looking at ways that we don't need to hose everything down with pesticides. We can sit and criticize people for using insecticides and so on, but we benefit. We push for that because that's the way that you get more yield from your land, and you can do so cheaply, and you can sell to supermarkets at the price they're willing to pay. It's an ecology that's not just a natural ecology, but it's our ecology, and it even goes into our sort of psychology. And I think we need to be addressing it holistically and thinking about it at societal level. There's more sensitive planting that we can do. There's a sort of move away from these massive monocultural fields with no margins and no sort of hedgerow or natural environment around them. That type of food production system, although very effective in many respects, is not particularly healthy for the environment. And that's what we're starting to realize, of course. What sort of health effects are we imposing on ourselves by living this way? We take up space, and we take up space in a very unsympathetic way generally, whether it's our residential areas, whether it's roads. We generally take up areas of the planet which would have been habitat, and then we replace them with areas which are at best very weak habitat, at worst no habitat at all. And that type of land use and that type of thing we have to be thinking about.
The challenge is one that lives on every level, as Phil and Adam say, in policy upon land use, chemicals and farming. But for you and me, the psychology of how we value pollinators and pollinating insects in particular, and of our expectations for what crops our land can provide and when. Gardens of all kinds are havens for pollinators. The diversity of plants we grow in our gardens, whether that's in towns, cities, or more rural landscapes, means we have an enticing space for different species. Urban spaces, in particular, have become havens for bees and wasps. Planting a few native wildflowers in your own space, whatever that happens to be, or letting lawns grow, are some ways in which we can all support our native insect species. Adverley Richmond is a plant, garden, landscape and social historian. She's brought these interests together in her book, A Short History of Flowers, where she's been exploring the stories behind some of our favourite garden plants. This gave her some fascinating insights into what our social history has meant for plants and pollinators.
Yucca gloriosa, which is commonly known as Adam's needle or Spanish dagger. It's mainly used as an architectural plant because it really is quite magnificent to look at when it's in flower. John Parkinson, the English botanist, in 1629, he actually observed that his plant didn't set seed. And it turns out that the yucca in its native habitat around California actually has a pollinator which it has co-evolved with. It wasn't until 1872 that a chap called Charles Valentine Riley actually discovered that this yucca needed the moth to pollinate it in order for it to set seeds. The yucca moth can't survive without the plant because it lays its eggs in the ovary of the plant. Once the larvae hatch, they will eat some of the seeds, not all of them. Once it's travelled away from its pollinator, it has to be hand pollinated or vegetatively propagated, so sort of cuttings and that kind of thing. It made me realise how fragile the balance of nature actually is when you remove one half of an arrangement. This is the same story with vanilla. It was brought from Mexico and distributed around Europe. And it took about 260 years for people to realize that vanilla planifolia had actually left its pollinator behind. And even now, all the vanilla flowers that produce the pods are hand pollinated. So, this interdependency between plants and their pollinators does demonstrate how the relocation of plants can impact on the sort of the fragility of nature. Plants collected in other parts of the world, once they are removed from their natural habitat, they do tend to lose their cultural identity. So, if a plant was used by the indigenous peoples for medicine or culinary or medicinal purposes, or even to make items of clothing or basketware, it leaves that identity behind and becomes purely ornamental, and which is what yucca has become. It is purely an ornamental plant.
Let's not forget that other pollinators, like bees, depend upon plants for healthy nutrition. So what happens when these chemicals are no longer available in their usual landscapes? Ellen Baker is a PhD student based in the Bee Lab at the University of Oxford and at Kew Gardens.
Just like the food in our supermarkets, the food from flowers varies in its nutritional content. Pollen, for instance, contains different amounts of fat and protein and amino acid, and nectar contains different types of sugars. But unlike in a supermarket where you could maybe just pick up a packet of pasta, turn it over and see, oh, it contains this much carbohydrate, it contains very little sugar. If we were to turn over a flower, so to speak, then most of that nutritional information is blank. And you're probably thinking, why does that actually matter? Why do we need to know how much carbohydrate or sugar is in different floral foods? But because we've changed our landscapes like a lot in the last half century in the UK, and we've got more things like urban areas and agricultural areas, and fewer things like wildflower meadows, we've actually been changing what food is available for bees. We might even be removing some like key nutritional resources from the landscape, but because we don't have the data, we just don't really know. And so the focus of our project was basically to fill in these blanks and to make a big catalogue of nutritional information about a wide range of plant and bee species in the UK. So we basically extracted pollen from over 250 wildflower species to see what of these different fats it was providing. And we looked in the body tissues of over 50 different bee species to see what it was that they were using in their tissues. And we focused on a group of fats called sterols that we know are really essential for bee growth and development. The main findings were that even closely related bee species actually had different needs. So they had adapted to using different fats and would therefore have different requirements in landscape. And the other key finding was that there was huge variation in like the different types and also total fats that were being provided by different flowers. So the overall kind of takeaway from this is that there's not one super plant that's going to happily support all bee species. And if we want to keep having diverse bee communities, we need to have some diverse wildflower communities in order to support them. Sterile probably sounds like a bit of an unfamiliar word, but I guarantee almost everyone is familiar with cholesterol. That's part of like this group of compounds. And so cholesterol is the one that's dominant in our tissues, and it's dominant in the tissues of like the majority of animals as well. Bees are a little bit different because instead of making their own cholesterol or turning what they eat into cholesterol, they basically just kind of eat different sterols, the sterols they get from plants, which are called phytosterols, and then they have to use these in their bodies instead. We'll be publishing our data hopefully over the next year, but it's found a really, really wide range of sterol compounds in these plant species. So bees have lots to choose from, but they've clearly got favourites.
Kew supports organisations who want to improve their biodiversity and green footprint. But one important thing to clear up is a common misconception around the plight of honeybees. Here's Phil again.
Between 2000 and 2010, there were two big stories that came out around bees. One of them was colony collapse disorder in the United States of America, where honeybees are a very important provider of pollination services to crucial crops. And in Europe, where studies were also looking at the wider community of pollinators and identifying that in some cases there were pollinator declines. These two stories came together in the press where essentially there was a clarion call to save bees. And that got very quickly distilled down to save the bee, which was then save the honeybee. And as a consequence, one solution was to keep honeybees. And many private sector organisations that want to have a green portfolio thought this was an excellent way of essentially addressing that challenge. The trouble is, there are not enough flowers in cities to be able to support all of those honeybees. We've actually done a study which demonstrates that in at least 50% of locations in London where we've got information on registered hives, there is an inadequate provision of floral resources for these honeybees, which means there's not enough resources for those honeybees, but there's also, therefore, not enough as well for all of the wild pollinators, the wild bee species, the butterflies, the moths, all of the other insects that are requiring those floral resources in cities. The trouble with honeybees, of course, is they're not really part of that biodiversity story. They're really a domestic animal. And as a domestic animal, it kind of equates to trying to save birds by keeping chickens. So if we're able to help the businesses that have the will and the want to do something right, if we can help them to understand different ways of supporting biodiversity, I think that's a much more productive way to go forward in cities.
As food sources for wildlife, trees provide some essential fuel for pollinators. And when it comes to planning our towns and cities, they can work as columns of biodiversity, growing upwards when space is limited. Making space for our friends to live and feed is something we can all do, whether it's hanging an insect box or planting a pot of wildflowers. It's a common misconception to think that all bees live in hives with a queen and make honey as a colony. The truth is that 90% of bees in the UK are solitary and mostly build individual nests in hollow stalks, sand, soil, wood, mortar, and so on. These are some of our best pollinators, so knowing more about them is a priority as we work to future-proof our landscapes. We joined Dr. Janine Griffiths-Lee, a pollinator researcher based at Wakehurst, Kew's Wild Botanic Garden in Sussex.
So we're in the Children's Wall Garden. It's a very grey day, but there's lots of nice bird song, and the Children's Wall Garden is getting a refurb. Today we're building an experimental bee bank, which we hope will encourage the nesting of ground nesting bees. We have 270 species of bee in the UK, and everybody knows about honeybees, and people generally know about bumblebees as well, but people really don't know very much about these solitary bees, and they're amazing pollinators, and they come out at different times of the year. They nest in different places, they forage on different things, and so they pollinate different things, and we need to conserve them all. 70% of our bees in the UK are ground nesting bees, and their nests are really hard to find in the wild, whereas we can really monitor and survey bumblebees and solitary bees that cavity nest by using solitary bee nest boxes. Ground nesting bees are much more difficult to follow and monitor and understand. So we found this really amazing study based in Germany, and they built these bee banks in agricultural settings and looked at the diversity of the bees that were nesting, and it was really incredible. And we thought, instead of just building these in agricultural landscapes and hoping for the best, we thought it would be really good to use it as an experimental site. We're going to have one in Yew Tree Meadow, which is near the visitor centre, and one that's right in the centre of Wakehurst, quite near the mansion in the Children's Walled Garden. We hope that other scientists will visit and use the bee banks for their research. But in terms of the research we're doing at Wakehurst, I'd really like to collect pollen from the bees when they return to their nests. It will influence any decision we make on habitat management and landscape planning. If we know what trees, for example, that they're visiting. We have about 1,500 species of tree and woody plant in Wakehurst. So we thought this had a unique question, that if bees had this amazing choice of tree pollen, what would they forage on? The trees They have a small physical footprint, but really that they're these huge sky meadows that are covered in pollen and nectar, and they usually flower much earlier than other flowering plants as well. So they give pollinators this pollen and nectar that they need, the essential resources to their life. We want to be able to advise landscape planners, especially in urban environments where space is a rare commodity. We want to be able to advise them on what trees to really plant that are great for pollinators.
Sky meadows, what an image. Planting the right trees provides us with the opportunity to create habitats and food to bolster ecosystems via pollinators and other wildlife, as well as controlling air pollution.
The bead bank is made of sandy soil, sandy loam, and it's going to be around 4 metres long, about 1.5 metres high and 3 metres wide. It's going to look quite beautiful as well, I think, when it's finished. It's going to have wildflower turf on the back to help its structural integrity, and it's going to be in amongst the walled garden, which is really highly diverse anyway for pollinators. So we really hope to see quite a high diversity of bees visiting the bank.
This piece of research is all part of Kew's Nature Unlocked programme, which is exploring fungi, natural connectedness, carbon above and below ground, seeds and hydrology. A wild landscape like Wakehurst is a playground for scientists wanting to do groundbreaking research. Making a bee bank needs the artisanal gardeners to do some dainty handiwork with their digger.
So the digger is now arriving. We decided on the shape of the bee bank in the children's wall garden, and it's a bean shape. So they're just getting the sand in the right position. They've taken off a layer of lawn, and now they're smoothing out the sandy loam soil in the position of the bee bank. And then that first layer is then going to be compacted, and then another layer goes on.
The team at Wakehurst have also developed an app as part of this work. Janine hopes that visitors to the gardens will get more involved in helping gather even more data on the local bugs. Chantal Lindsay went to find out more.
Hi, I'm Chantal Lindsay and I'm a wildlife conservationist and all-round nature lover. And today it's really special because I'm here at Wakehurst. And now Wakehurst is doing a great thing. They have a citizen science project called Trees for Bees. It's an app that collects data about pollinators visiting flowering and pollen-producing trees. And we're here in late April, so things are really starting to bud and come to life. Okay, I've opened up Trees for Bees app. If I click the little red pointer, I can see there's an English oak just down here on the right, and I love an English oak, so I'm going to head down there. Okay, so now that I've found my tree, I'm going to pop that into the app. I'm ready to begin my 3-minute observation of this tree. I've got to focus my observation on a 1 metre section of a flowering branch. Now I'm going to click on, and my 3 minutes starts now. Oh, we've got a bird, we've got a robin. I don't think that counts. As I'm observing, it's calming me down, it's bringing me into the now, and so this is actually really good for mental health as well. You can see the buds that have not burst just yet. Right, okay, I'm gonna check my timer now. Oh, 3, 2, 1. Time's up. Okay, so we didn't actually see any pollinators on this English oak 007, and that's absolutely fine because that's exactly what the scientists want to know. So, open my map up again, see if we can have another look and find a tree elsewhere. So, we found our tree, Japanese Andromeda. It's very obviously in flower, so I'm really excited. So let's do this. Come on, the pollinators. The hoverflies are coming in. They're winning right now. If this was a competition, they'd be winning. It also just goes to show how important it is to have plants that flower at different times, because you'll have different pollinators, bumblebee, buff-tailed bumblebee, emerging at different times, and they'll need their pollen sources. So that's why, you'll have ones that are in flower at the moment and ones that aren't. Time's up, voila, we did it. We had one that was flowering and it was supporting lots and lots. I keep pausing because I can just hear all the buzzing. Lots and lots of pollinators, so that is epic news.
Whereas trees can begin to flower in April and flourish in May and June, in the summer months the wildflowers step in, and Wakehurst's diverse meadow habitats are host to a stunning array of species. As temperate grasslands, They can be found all over the world, with different plant communities. But it's not just pollinators these special places support. As part of the Nature Unlocked programme, researchers here invited visitors to nominate the landscapes that gave them the greatest sense of well-being, and meadows came out on top. Ian Parkinson explained more.
I'm the head of landscape and horticulture here at Wakehurst Kew's Wild Botanic Garden, and I'm stood in the middle of the Coronation Meadow, surrounded by a wonderfully rich matrix of wild plants. This meadow is one of my favourite places at Wakehurst. It's a place I often seek out when I want to escape from the trials and tribulations of everyday life. One way to try and understand the meaning and significance of a meadow is to think of it as a community of wild plants. It's an ecosystem that's so finely balanced that not a single plant has to work hard to fit in, but every blade of grass, every fragile flower has equal opportunities to stand out. As we look around us now, I can see a wonderful tapestry of plants beneath our feet. It's a tightly woven matrix where different flowers, grasses, sedges, rushes, and even some ferns all rub shoulder together. Every plant has found its niche and has enough space in which to thrive. Of course, some plants are more striking than others. Here's a lovely cluster of common spotted orchids, which have such a wonderful beauty of form. What we see above ground is strongly influenced by what's going on below ground. So under our feet, in the subterranean world of soils, lives another community, a community of microscopic threads of mycorrhiza fungi. Mycorrhiza form a mutually beneficial alliance with plants. The invisible is important as well. We created the Coronation Meadow about 5 years ago now, and we're only just starting to see orchids appear. Orchids often take many years to go from seed to flower. Some people think that creating or restoring a meadow is a science, and in many ways it is, but it's certainly not an exact science. It takes a lot of patience and perseverance to grow a meadow, as these orchids testify. So in this regard, a meadow is more a labour of love. The rare plants and common plants coexist together. One common plant, but a very important plant, is yellow rattle, sometimes called hay rattle. Farmers used to call this plant poverty because it used to reduce the yield of their hay. But these days we use it to help our conservation efforts. Just next to the common spotted orchids is another really wonderful plant. It's called Dyer's greenweed. And this is special because it's an important pollinator plant for a range of micro moths. I'm looking at a very mature oak tree that I know is home to a family of barn owls. And those barn owls will be feeding on the mice and the voles that are scurrying around the bases of the hedgerows that create a frame for this meadow. But meadows are also fragile. If you neglect them, they'll lose their lustre. They need to be well managed and nurtured throughout their entire life in order to reach their full potential. Sadly, over the past 70 years or so, we've lost almost all of our ancient meadows in the British Isles, from being converted to arable or silage production, through to neglect, mismanagement. They've evolved under a traditional pattern of management, which starts in spring when the grasses and flowers are allowed to grow. Just when the meadow has reached its summer peak, it's cut, and the grasses and flowers are left to dry in the sun for a few days before being turned into hay. The hay is stored and used to feed livestock through the winter. Following the hay cut, the meadow puts out a new flush of nutrient-rich grass, and at that time we bring the livestock back onto the meadow. I'm really excited to see our meadows come alive through our Meadowlands summer programme. The artistic installations will tell the story of the meadow as it moves through the seasons.
Wakehurst is also home to an American prairie, inspired by the grasslands of North America. This ambitious project saw 50,000 plug plants placed in the landscape to create a sea of gold in the summer, and a bustling habitat for wildlife and pollinators. Prairies are one of the world's most threatened habitats, with only 1% remaining. Isabel Milligan's studies into prairie species and pollinators brought her to the site at Wakehurst during its development. She explained that supporting these kinds of habitats can have benefits to wildlife, as well as a myriad of other ecosystem services.
American prairies are absolutely vast. I think outside of African grasslands and savannas, they are some of the biggest swathes of temperate grassland in the world. And if you go back sort of a few hundred years, these typically would have been grazed by buffalo across the landscape, and indigenous nomadic groups would have lived across them, sort of rotating these grazing animals, and the conditions there were historically incredibly diverse, and you could see different sort of structural diversity and complexity in species, including sort of flowering species, grass species, and then also from a soil perspective as well, so the different kinds of microbes in the soil. Over time, as kind of humans have encroached into the landscape, the land use has changed. And so what you've seen is a sort of reduction in that diversity, the removal of certain pressures and disturbances within those ecosystems. And so the benefits of, say, carbon sequestration or biodiversity, of course, when you're talking about flowering species, then pollination as well. Those ecosystem service benefits have slightly been removed where human pressures have kind of taken their place. Prairie floral species are usually, when they're healthy, they're incredibly diverse. And this is brilliant because not only does it sort of attract mass diversity of pollinators, but it also means that there are the resources and refuge for pollinators. So it provides them literally with the food, but it also provides them with the sort of the habitat to reproduce safely. So that's the kind of the value of prairies to pollinators. When these prairie ecosystems are threatened by any number of pressures and you lose that diversity of flowering species and resource species, then that in turn makes it an unattractive place for a pollinator to exist. So it simply won't be there. And that pollinator itself will be carrying out incredibly important functions. So in the context of Kew, actually, it's a really good example because there's a lot of farmland surrounding Wakehurst. There are a lot of pollinators there because there's a lot of regenerative agricultural practice going on nearby. So it's a safe place for pollinators to be because they have their resources, they've got refuge, they've got habitat, and they can carry out those pollination services on the farms, in people's gardens. If you kind of extrapolate that to a global scale where those resources are being removed for whatever reason, then if the resources are removed, then the ecosystem service provided by the pollinators will also be removed because they simply won't be there anymore.
Kew partners with organisations all around the world to support research into preserving biodiversity. Work that connects livelihoods to nature is one of the most practical and impactful approaches to putting research into practice on the ground. Off to Tanzania now, to hear from Dr. Philemon Elisante, a researcher working at the University of Dodoma.
My research interest is on biodiversity conservation, including pollination ecology, particularly in smallholder farming system. Currently, I'm also working on urban pollinators, trying to check on the importance of the garden flowers in Dodoma.
Philemon carried out fieldwork working with farmers in the Kilimanjaro region, in areas at different elevations worked by the Chaga people. His focus was in changing the way they thought about using field margins, encouraging pollinators like hoverflies and wasps, which in turn can act as a pesticide alternative to chemicals.
The way they were using the field margins, it was like, they were using like a boundary mark, that means between the farms, but also they were using a place where they can get extra feed for the livestock. But also in some fields, they use that field to grow trees, the fruit trees, the avocado and others. But they did not include the field margins as a part where they can maintain some species, particularly the flowering species, that could help to provide the additional food for the pollinators when there is no crops in the field, but as well as to provide a nesting site for this particular insect. So the other issues that also we ask them to do is to not use the synthetic pesticides, or as well as not to use the herbicides that could actually kill these field margin plants. The aim was to help farmers actually to understand the role of pollinators in increasing yield, particularly in smallholder farming system. The other issue was also to identify and record the potential field margin plants that could help to maintain the population of these pollinators in smallholder farming system. Normally, they are doing a mixed farming as they have small plots. So normally they plant sunflower, maize, common beans, and other vegetable crops. Across the elevation, you can find that every farm is actually growing beans and maize as well. In those cross-pollinated crops, actually they require pollinators so as to increase the fertilization and increase the yield. The studies have shown worldwide that the pollinators can increase the yield even for the crops that do not much actually require pollinators for production. So the first thing what we did about the issues related to pollination, we actually used some species of pollinators which are common there, the hoverflies, the honeybees, as well as the leafcutter bees. And we found that the knowledge for these farmers were actually low. And what we did was actually to train them on the importance of these pollinators. We also introduced to them environmental friendly or agroecological farming practices that would actually help to maintain these pollinators in their fields. And then 1 year later, the same farmers who were trained well about the pollinators and agroecological practices were also interviewed because we wanted to know if they have at least changed their practices as well as if they retained the knowledge that they received during training. So we got very good results. So we also trained the agricultural extension officers who are actually responsible on day-to-day activities on helping farmers. So we also trained them so that they could help to train other farmers who were not trained.
In addition to helping farmers drive yield by altering how they manage field margins, the team provided lists of medicinal plants and those which could be used as botanical pesticides, enabling farmers to maximise the benefits of planting diverse species for health and yield, whilst also providing fodder for livestock. Philemon is now looking at ways to support urban pollinators in the increasingly arid region around Dodoma. Let's return to Kew Gardens now, where entomologist and creepy-crawly lover Dr. Eleanor Drinkwater met with Phil Stevenson to discuss how the interactions of plants and wildlife hold the key to making a healthier planet in general.
Addressing biodiversity loss begins with us understanding these really fascinating, complex interactions between species and within ecosystems. Within my own work as an entomologist, I'm passionate about championing the role of our mini-beasts, including pollinating insects, in supporting healthy ecosystems and other wildlife. But many of our agricultural and developmental practices have reshaped environments of these creatures, or worse, disregarded them as pests. Joining me to discuss how plants and wildlife interact to enhance biodiversity is Phil Stevenson. Thanks so much for joining me today, and do you want to just tell me a little bit about where we are?
Well, we're in the kitchen garden, which is a relatively new addition to Kew's offer. Certainly in the middle of summer, this will look like everybody's perfect vegetable patch. Essentially, it provides lots of very interesting stories about traditional vegetables, and for many of them, there will be examples where they are dependent on pollinators. So it's a very appropriate place to be having this conversation.
Everybody at the moment is very concerned about climate change, and particularly our native pollinators. Have you got any particular species that you're particularly concerned about?
So it's really the specialists that we should be most worried about. There is an argument that if they're so specialist, then what is their meaningful contribution? But really we need to have a very strong focus on maintaining biodiversity, because within biodiversity you have much greater resilience to change and to those global challenges.
How would you describe to our listeners how we've seen declines in the UK and the species in the UK over the last 100 years or so?
Well, a really good example actually is lowland heaths.
Yeah.
One of the main flowering plants in lowland heaths is Calluna heather. And our research here at Kew Gardens has recently identified chemicals that occur naturally in the nectar. In addition to the sugar, of course, nectar is a reward for pollinators and they use it for energy. But alongside that, these flowers on Calluna heather produce a chemical that is antimicrobial, so it's biologically active against microbes. And we've shown that it's active against a pathogen or a disease of bumblebees. So it could be a natural medicine in the landscape. The trouble is, in the last 200 years, our lowland heaths have declined by perhaps 90% and been replaced by potentially other flowering plants. And what we're worried about is that those other flowering plants don't produce the full suite of benefits to pollinators that the heather did, which was the food and the medicine. And so that's an example of where we have a decline in our floral landscapes that might have consequences that we perhaps didn't really imagine when we changed those landscapes.
One of the things I always love about coming to visit Kew is the amazing diversity of plants that you can hardly move for different species. How does this impact on what insects you get here?
Great question. So one of the things that we've done in the last few years is actually use bees as a barometer of invertebrate diversity, partly because there aren't as many of them as some groups of insects like wasps. In fact, there are more bee species in Kew Gardens than there are in Ireland. But of course, I'm very excited about the full range of pollinating species. And of course, it's not just bees, is it?
I often feel like there's so many other brilliant pollinators that just don't get a look in the UK. So people often don't realise that species like hoverflies are incredibly important and beautiful pollinators. But not only that, they're incredible pest controllers as well. Really, what's not to love? And obviously, the favourite one, the marmalade hoverfly, is just spectacular to look at. So really, an all-rounder.
Yeah, absolutely. They are a target of our work in East Africa, actually. We're doing work where we're trying to improve field margins around smallholder farming to support both pollinators but also beneficial insects. Most of the work we've done is actually on parasitic wasps, which of course really need those floral field margins for the nectar, and then they move into the fields themselves and then lay their eggs in the aphids. So we have shown that our changes to floral margins or field margins has actually influenced the pest regulation in those fields.
That is incredible. I love parasitic wasps. They're one of my favourite invertebrates.
I think that's the next challenge for entomologists, to get the public to love wasps, isn't it? I think it's perhaps a challenge maybe too far. But one of the things that I think is particularly interesting about wasps, people have their minds blown when you tell them there are nearly 300 species of bees. But as far as I understand, there's something like 9,000 different wasp species in the UK.
So maybe people just haven't met the right wasp yet. Maybe that's just... Can we link this back to understanding ecosystem health and how we can make our ecosystems more healthy?
Yeah. Well, firstly, I think there are two ways of looking at ecosystem health. One of the things that we find in research, certainly on pollinators and specifically on bees, is there's plenty of work on individual bees, quite a bit of work on bees at the colony level, but not so much work on populations, and almost none on communities. And one way of looking at the health of bees at a community level is if you see a decline in one species, but another species comes in to provide that ecosystem service, then actually you could have a more balanced way of understanding the health of that ecosystem from a community level. On the other hand, that overlooks the importance of diversity, and if we're losing one species, it may be important then to kind of try and understand what it is about that landscape that is causing that species to decline. And I think that will enable us to then inform policy to have interventions in those landscapes that are much more meaningful. Currently we have approaches where farmers buy seed mixes to put in as field margin flower mixes. Many of these are very good for supporting generalist pollinators, many of which aren't even at risk.
Yeah.
And I think what we need is much more information on which of the flower species should go into those mixes to actually enable us to support a much greater diversity of species in those landscapes.
Yeah, I'm always so surprised by the fact that, we've studied so many of these animals for so many years now, but some of that fundamental biological information about what food does it prefer or what's going to be useful to it, we still just don't know.
That's right.
Yeah.
So some of the nutrients that bees need are only available in certain flowering species, and that might be one of the reasons why some species of bees are limited in the food sources that they can source for their food and nectar and providing for their offspring.
That sounds like a fascinating study. How do you think we could link that particular case study back to other climate zones like the UK?
Well, that's a great question. So one of the challenges we face there is farms in the UK generally have much larger fields. Smallholders typically are very small fields, and so the benefit of a field margin could be across the whole field, whereas in the UK we would need to think about how we might improve the farming approach so that we've got opportunities for those beneficial insects at every point in the field. So maybe flower strips going down fields, and of course that's slightly problematic because a farmer would rather see crops there than flower strips, but if it means that we're able to have these services that reduce the need for pesticides, then maybe that's compensating for the fact that the farmer will have to use less. But certainly in the broadest sense, I think being able to recognise the value of natural processes in producing food and more agroecological approach to food production, I think there's an awful lot to be learned there.
Well, certainly. I'm lucky enough to work at Anglo-Ruskin University, and where I teach on some of our land-based courses. And so some of the work that we've talked about bee cognition and the impacts of neonicotinoids and that kind of thing, we're taking that research and kind of really putting that into training the next generation of farmers. And so both in terms of how we can appreciate invertebrates as incredible, majestic individuals who are complex and exciting and kind of feeding that hunger to learn about these amazing animals, but then also kind of very practically as well, understanding these species' life cycles, understanding, how we can kind of best use things like hoverflies to the best of our abilities. So there's a lot of ways in which we are using research being done at Kew and other places in order to kind of really drive forwards that research-led teaching at universities as well. Though I have to say, I have been so impressed by a lot of the young farmers coming out. They are so smart, so excited, and they often challenge me about, different things I haven't even thought of. And a lot of them are definitely up for that challenge.
Whether it's looking again at the way we use land for agriculture, development, or wildlife, or how we share exciting research and its practical uses, the more we learn, the more options we have to make changes and develop innovative ways of living to support biodiversity. Whilst we can plant wildflowers or leave our lawns unmown without much fuss, some of the harder questions for you and me are around our value for creepy crawlies, our willingness to appreciate mixed, messier-looking landscapes, or even in what we expect to find on our supermarket shelves. By addressing pesticide use and managing landscapes with wildlife, particularly pollinators, in mind, it's possible to benefit ecosystem and human health the world over too. And we can thank plants and fungi for showing us the way. Next time on Unearth, Nature Needs Us, I'll be asking what it means to restore degraded habitats and how to do it well under changing contexts and climates. I'll be back in a fortnight. You can find out more about Kew and support their vital scientific and educational work at kew.org. And don't forget, you can catch up on earlier series of the podcast on this feed too. Please follow and subscribe.